Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K through 12 school shooting database. And at the end of each week, when I've gone through the different news alerts and updated the database, I often look back and think, like, what a crazy week. I can't believe all these different things happened on campus because there are shootings every single week, usually almost every day on a school campus somewhere in the country. But this last week is really extraordinary because it has three different examples of different types of pre-planned, very deliberate attacks. At a university in Utah last week, there was a sniper attack from a rooftop. That's something that we've seen about a dozen times at K through 12 schools over the last couple decades. There was also a surprise attack by a student inside the cafeteria of his school in suburban Denver. So a very high performing high school, exactly the type of affluent mountain community where you'd say violence like this would never happen in this place. But a kid pulled a gun out and started firing at his classmates. And as they ran, he kept reloading. He reloaded 5 different times, chasing students from corner to corner of the campus before police arrived. And then what really didn't get any attention this week is an assistant principal at a middle school in the suburbs of Illinois. She stands in front of the school at the front door in the morning and the afternoon when students are coming and leaving to either greet them or tell them goodbye. And so she was standing outside at dismissal this week. Her husband came to the campus with a rifle and fired 30 shots, and he killed her and killed a bystander and then killed himself. And this happened at dismissal of the middle school. So I think every time we see these incidents, I think, what would I do? How would I deal with that situation? So the guest this week is an author of a book about exactly this, how to survive mass shootings. Simon Osamoh, welcome to the show.
David, as a long-time listener of your show, an honor and a privilege to be here and excited to just share some encouragement for people about what I can do in the moment to persevere adversity. So thank you for having me on.
So Simon, you have a bit of a funny accent, which I don't think that's how people in Minnesota normally talk. What exactly is a Brit doing in the States, studying security and writing books about surviving mass shootings?
Yeah, so great question. So a little bit about my history. So I joined law enforcement when I was 19 in the United Kingdom, so very young. I became a detective, I believe, by the time I was 22, disappeared into organized crime and sort of terrorism investigations. And then met my American wife, believe it or not, in Australia in the mid 2000s. And then in 2011, I emigrated here to Minnesota with my American wife to be head of counterterrorism at Mall America. So my time in British law enforcement was predominantly as a detective in covert investigations, so wiretap, surveillance, covert entries, tackling England's organised criminals. And then I sort of added physical security being at Mall America. And it was really at Mall America where I got into security consulting and writing. But I was actually talking at a sports conference in Disney, David. I think it used to be called NSC4. I think it's now NSC5. But it was for all the leaders of Major League Baseball, the NHL, NFL. And actually, the police department reached out and said, you know, we know you're the security experts. We have a church here in Minnesota we think needs your help. Can you help them? And I said, what many people still say to this day, why does a church need my help? And I went there one day and realized there was a real need for safety and security in houses of worship. And that really catapulted me to realize that for open door public venues, there's a lot more that could be done. And so that's how I sort of ended up here in the US. A lot to take in there, David.
Mall of America, I think there's a thought in society that Amazon and online shopping killed malls. I know malls were a very important part of my childhood growing up. And then when I've been in Minnesota, Mall of America is absolutely enormous. Can you kind of explain, like, what was the allure of going to work at Mall of America, and what should somebody who's never visited that and thinks shopping malls aren't relevant anymore kind of know about that type of facility?
Yeah, so Mall of America in Minneapolis, Minnesota is, I think, 7.2 million square feet to give context. I mean, as David mentioned, I mean, it is incredible the size of it. Has a theme
So
park
your
inside.
average supermarket is maybe 50,000 square feet, and
Yeah,
you're saying
or less.
7
Yeah, 50,000.
million.
This
So
is 7 million. Yeah, I think it's 7.2. Yeah, to give it context, this is huge, and it has. This is going to help people level set and understand. David, it has 42 million annual visitors per year, so it's actually bigger than Disney because it's free to get in. So over 7 million square feet, 42 million visitors a year, 700 stores. I think there's now two hotels. There's a theme park, movie theatre. So it's an incredible, incredible place. And I've got to be honest, David, when I first emigrated here, when I was in the United Kingdom, I'd worked an animal rights case and had some connections with the FBI here in Minnesota, became friends with a couple of agents. And I was looking to emigrate, and I said, where does someone like me go? Because in the US, David, I'm a combination of different agencies. So we used to do the phone tap or the wiretap. We used to do the surveillance, we used to prosecute the cases, we do all the financial crimes investigations. So I'm a combination of different agencies. And I was saying to my friends at the FBI, where does someone like me with my skills, where do I go in the corporate world? And they said, well, there's an opening at Mall of America. They're looking for someone like you. It might be a good fit. And being very honest, David, my initial impression was a super mall. I'd seen the Paul Black film, Mall Cops, and I was like, is this really a place to go? And I was invited in to tour the facility by the security director at the time. And I was just impressed, David, with how the security program was put together there. It was built on layers of security or circles of security. So if people aren't too familiar, that means that you look at one specific problem and then you apply different safety measures, different layers of security around it. And the mall had everything from bike officers to bomb explosive canines to an undercover unit. Was what I oversaw. They had an intelligence analyst, they had uniformed officers, they had law enforcement, they had a traffic division. So it was just an incredible place to really get my start in America. And yeah, I was just really impressed by how we do it. And touch some wood, some of my good friends still there. I think the fact that so few incidents have happened at Mall of America really demonstrates how strong those layers of security are, and I think the importance of layers of security.
yeah, because the a mall of that size where you've got hotels and retail and the theme park and theaters and so on, and it's essentially a mini city. And
Yes.
the mini city is something that's applicable to lots of places that have their own special purpose police department, because that's what your college campus is, a mini city. Downtown business improvement district is kind of a sub city within a city. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense in that. So, in these shootings that happened in the last week, one of them was your open campus, so your college campus, kind of central quad square area. Another was your other area of expertise, a shooting that took place outside of a church, firing inward at the people there. And then finally, the school in Illinois was your kind of suburban, urban schoolhouse that sits directly on a residential street. So the door opens directly to the sidewalk. This isn't, your big Texas mega campus where there's, 100 yards between the street and the front door. Like the door is there on the street. Thinking about Mall of America and your different layers and rings and places in there, how do you start to describe dealing with an active shooter when it can take place in such different settings that all have completely different things you're thinking about with security?
And I think the first piece is around awareness and understanding. And I think, David, in today's modern world, is acceptance. So I wrote a book for churches a few years ago called Secure Church Operations. And security culture is the first thing I advise any organization to do. And in 2017, there was a mass shooting at a church in Sutherland Springs, First Baptist Church, Sutherland Springs. 26 people lost their lives, 26 people injured. I've become friends with a former pastor there. And he would say, David, that he was in denial. He never believed it could happen. And here's the crazy thing about that story. The night before, he wasn't at the church. He was in Oklahoma getting a certification in for the church. The night before, someone said to him, Frank, are you concerned with the safety and security at your church? And he said, we're a small church in southern Texas. Nothing is ever going to happen. Less than 11 hours after that conversation, an armed gunman walks into his church, kills 26 people. One of those was his own 14-year-old daughter. So a tragic event. So I think when you look at these different environments, David, I think part of it is that culture, awareness, and acceptance that these things are possible. I'm working with a large college campus right now. I have 18 different buildings, and I went to visit it a couple of weeks ago, and everything was open, and they're obviously starting that journey. So I think you have to have the acceptance that these things do happen. And then I think it comes down to the programming and details. As we sort of started to allude towards, layers of security, circles of security is, these are sort of multidisciplinary. These are sort of, there's various different ways to look at mass shootings and active shooters. And I don't think there's any one single answer, but I think you've got to build a program which is based on training. Training gives you hope in the moment. Hope is often what leads people to persevere. I think it's close to 10% of a lot of these mass shootings are ended by someone who's unarmed, who's just said, not today, I'm going to step in. And then you need sort of culture training. Then you need sort of risk management, good programming, good policies, good process, ways to identify those that could be on a pathway to violence. And then you've got to think about, well, what is that response? When seconds count in today's modern world, the police are minutes away. When seconds count, the police are minutes away. So what is your response going to look like in those first few minutes? I think if you can build a strong security culture, if you can build the processes and planning, and then you can build your response, I think that is the great starting point to say what can we actually do in the physical security world to try and either sort of prevent, delay, or sort of defend against some of these public shootings that we're seeing.
And that really ties into your book, which the book is very accessible. It's only 100 pages or so.
It's written for men, David. I wrote it for men so I can read it quickly.
Yes, it has lots of bold headings with lists of actionable things to do. Each set of recommendations then has a couple different case studies that highlight the points in there. Why did you decide to first write this book, and then how did you come up with kind of the format and content that was going to go into this?
Yeah. So initially, when I train a lot of active shooter survival training, it's built around run, hide, fight. And if people aren't too familiar with the process of run, hide, fight, post Sandy Hook, I believe Obama set the FBI the task of find this national program. What can we do as the federal government to fight back against mass shootings? And so the Houston Police Department were already using run, hide, fight. So that got adopted by the FBI and schools and then the sort of wider world. I think what happened over the time was people considered run, hide, fight to be an order, David, rather than a menu. So when I educate, depending on the adverse situation you find yourself in, you may need to run first, you may need to hide first, or you may need to fight. So I think that run, hide, fight lost its way because we used to teach it as an order. Oh, well, I've got to run first, and if I can't run, I've got to hide. If I can't hide, I fight. So I found this sort of ambiguity now in people's understanding of it. So that sort of first started my fascination with it. And then being sort of a security practitioner, my 13-year-old came home one day and said, Dad, we did a drill and it didn't feel right. I said, well, what do you mean? And he'd done a lockdown drill. And he said, well, we did the drill, the teacher locked the door, and then he went to his keyboard and he's like typing away, doing his work, and he said we all then just sat in the corner on our phones. And I said, so the teacher just used the time to do what, education or mark papers? He said, yeah, he just sat at his desk and was just typing away, and we were just all sat in the corner. And obviously, David, you know as well, when your listeners might know, that isn't the right attitude, that isn't the right culture. So it caused me to research and actually arranged a meeting with the school superintendent. And I said, if what my son told me is true, this goes against the last decade of trying to keep our schools safe. But they apologised, said it was going to change. But it started me on this journey, David, to say, how do we better inform people about what to do? And me as a security practitioner, I wanted to make sure my son was aware of the things to do. And then I met a woman called Meredith Elizadeh, whose son Nicholas was killed in a school shooting, Roxborough High School in Philadelphia in 2022.
Can you
I,
pause about that? Because I think
yes,
that's
absolutely.
a shooting that I reported quite a bit about. I don't think anybody really knows outside of you and as the community in
Oh
the
wow, yeah.
Philadelphia area. Yeah. So Roxbury in 2022. What happened there?
Yeah, so and I'll tell you from the perspective of Meredith, and I know David, on your podcast, you do great reporting on these high school football games shootings. So Nick was there. Actually, his mother was there. There was multiple assailants that during that high school game that started shooting. Nick tragically was 14 years old. He was one that was hit and killed. His mother Meredith was actually there. Her only son was killed, and then she held him in her arms as he passed away. And I got to hear about that. I think the assailants, at the time of recording this podcast, I think the trial for the assailants, I think, is next month. And I spoke to Meredith, and she echoed, David, similar to what my son had said. She said, I don't want to blame the teachers. I think I talk about this in the book, perhaps. She says, I don't want to blame the teachers, but she said everyone was running around and no one really knew what to do. And she said that was one thing that she noticed in a moment, that no one knew what to do. And when Meredith was telling me the story how Nick had been killed in this high school football game shooting, Meredith was crying, I was crying. This was around 8 weeks after it had happened. She was crying, I was crying. And I hadn't really sort of gone into this world too much, David, in like sort of mass shootings. I'm a physical security sort of SME, you might say, an expert witness, but that really propelled me to say we have to do better. We have to do more. Um, I couldn't even put myself in a position as to how Meredith would be losing her only son to school gun violence when he was going there to support the high school team. No one expected that to happen. So it was a combination of those events, really, David, realizing that run, hide, fight perhaps lost its place in education. My son saying that his school teacher wasn't taking it seriously. And then having that interaction with Meredith, where her son died, and reporting that the teachers didn't really know what to do, I said, I've got to just create a very basic template that people can follow. So, as David mentions, it's right, there's a lot of bold text, there's a lot of short bullet points. And the book is really designed for when I can't remember what I said to you in the book, David, when I sent you a signed copy. But normally, what I say to people when I send them a signed copy of the book is that I pray to God that you never need this book. But if you ever do, I hope it gives you the tips and tools to stay safe. So the book is designed to be able to be read in 90 minutes or less and just do a great job in leading with preparedness, not with fear. It's very easy around mass shooters, active shooter, to lead with fear, but the book leads with preparedness first and then fear second. So yeah, that's how it all came together.
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting that your impetus there is the shooting at the high school football game, because that gets so little attention, even though it's a constant issue. I mean, just this past week,
Yeah,
there were 3 people shot at 2 different high school football games on Friday, and one of them was just a person sitting in the stands, and they don't know who fired the shot, but it struck a person sitting in the stands. And then 2 teens were shot during a fight that escalated at another
yeah,
game. And your point that there are parents, there are families that are deeply impacted by these shootings that really nobody hears about or pays any attention to. In terms of preparedness instead of fear, what's the first takeaway or lesson that you want somebody to be thinking about preparedness with a shooting?
yeah. And I think in preparedness, it comes with a lot of mindset. So I think you've said this before, David. I don't want to call you out on your own podcast, but some people say, is there any scientific evidence that training, run, high, fight actually makes a difference? I think you've commented on this before. But I think what it starts with is the hope. So I think the first level of preparedness is really the hope you can persevere. And I know, David, you do judo, right? Is it judo that you do? Judo or
Brazilian
jiu-jitsu?
jiu-jitsu.
Brazilian jiu-jitsu you do. So you have to go into it believing that I can win. Because if you don't go into it believing you can persevere, I can beat this opponent, you've already lost the battles. I think
Sadly,
I,
once you do it long enough, you realize that losing is inevitable.
well, that's true. Yeah,
But
there's
that
always
happens.
someone better.
Yes.
I said to my son who plays soccer, so there's always someone better than you out there. But, you've got to start with that hope. So, and you know the data better than me. I think it's around 10%, it's 8, 9, 10% of these activist states mass shooter are stopped by someone who's unarmed. So I think the preparedness comes from the foundation is you've got to have hope. You've got to have hope that you can persevere because as humans, when we enter with a positive mindset, I mean, it's amazing what we can achieve. I think the second level about preparedness then comes that you need to create these templates that you do time and time again to keep yourself safe. So, as an example, when I didn't spend too much time in uniform in the police in England because I was a detective very young, but when I would always put a vehicle over, doing a traffic stop, I would always approach the vehicle in the same way. On one occasion, when I didn't, and I walked between my police vehicle and the assailant's vehicle, what the assailant did was I saw the reverse lights came on. And he was trying to trap me between the two vehicles. I was like, holy moly, I had to jump out of the way. And it caught me off guard because I'd gone outside my template. So preparedness is, and I'll talk about this in the book, is really understanding your environment and following the same processes time and time again. When my family go to a restaurant, David, and we're looking to be sat, do you know where me and my family always sit when we go to a restaurant? Any ideas where we sit?
I would guess that you are somebody who always wants to have a view of the door.
Correct. And we sit close to the kitchen. The reason why most restaurants in the kitchen have a door to get outside. So we build this template that my kids, it's not the best seat in the house. It's noisy, it's smelly. There's a lot of traffic, but we have that preparedness, we have that template. If we always sit close to the kitchen, more than likely there's a door there. I will always ask the server, where is the closest door to get outside this restaurant? And it takes me 10 seconds. They give me the answer, and I've done that. When I go to a movie theatre, we take the Aurora movie theatre shooting during the Batman movie. Where do my family sit when we go to a movie theatre? We sit on that front row. Do my family like it? Do my two sons like it? No, they hate it because they're constantly looking up at the screen. However, what do you have at the front row? There's the two emergency exits. Most often they leave outside. So I think the preparedness is it's not with that fear, but it's thinking about where am I going and then doing these consistent things time and time again. I'm hoping to try and train my two sons. If you do these things, that's your level of preparedness, and you'll do it without even realizing. Tragically, at Mall of America, I think it was 2019. There's 3 floors to the Mall of America. I forget how high up it probably is. It could be 60 feet. A young child was walking with their family. Someone with mental illness picked up this kid, threw him over, went down three levels, landed on a concrete floor. Amazing act of a higher power. This kid survived. So when we go to the Mall of America with my family, I say, do not walk close to the edge, walk alongside the building. Do they like it? No. But again, it's building that template, but they'll do it so often now, they'll do it without even realizing. So the preparedness comes from just looking at what's been happening and just creating these templates, and the consistency is what's going to help you to build that preparedness. And that's when you don't have to work in fear. You just start doing these things without even realizing their sort of safety. Does that sort of make sense, David?
It does. I mean, it reminds me that my coworkers used to make fun of me when I worked in Washington, D.C., and we worked around federal buildings, and the subway runs under the city. And there are these metal grates, which are the ventilation shafts from the
Yeah.
subway tunnels, and they're in the middle of the sidewalk. And I would never walk directly over one of the sideway grates, because if it's that day when the rusty frame gives out, I don't want to be the one falling 60 feet. So taking, two
Yeah.
steps to the left and waiting for traffic to pass so that you can walk around rather than over, I think is that mentality of constant risk management, of saying something that takes a couple seconds is worth avoiding a foreseeable yet unlikely catastrophe. And that was very much, the roots of before I started the school shooting database, uh, one of the very first articles that I ever published online when Medium was a popular platform was the morning after the Las Vegas Harvest Festival shooting.
Mm.
I was working at Department of Homeland Security then. I had been involved in a lot of active shooter training, in developing workplace preparedness guidelines, and that morning, looking at what happened in Vegas, it didn't feel like anything that we were teaching would be applicable there. So I wrote this article that morning called "When You Can't Run, Hide or Fight," and I talked about if you're sitting in the center of a movie theater, you can't run, hide, or fight somebody who's shooting
Yeah.
at you from the front. If you're at a concert venue and somebody's shooting from the 40th floor, you can't run, hide, or fight. But now that I'm listening to you, the point of those is that you need to take a little bit of extra effort to think about your setting, think about the worst case scenario, and think about what you would do in that moment, even if a general statement or mantra or slogan doesn't necessarily apply to where you are.
Yeah, and the Marines, I think it was the Marines that were credited with this, David, or often it's most credited with the Marines, but they say the body cannot go where the mind hasn't been. We don't want to think about school shootings, but that is the reality of the world that we live in. So when we use that mantra, the body can't go where the mind hasn't been, we've got to think about if it was to happen today, what does this look like? The Covenant school shooting in Nashville, Tennessee, 2023. The substitute teacher was killed, the custodian was killed, the principal was killed, and then some little children were killed. They were all killed in a transition area because the fire alarm was going off and they could hear glass being shattered, and pretty much the substitute teacher was trying to evacuate the building. The principal and the custodian, they went towards the danger, not knowing what it is. Well, if they'd studied other mass shooters and how these operate, often they do set the fire alarms, and often there is smoke and discoordination. So we don't want to accept this, David, but these mass shooters and activists, they're studying, they're going online and they're studying and they're doing the research. So at the same time they're doing that, we can also study and say, knowing what they know, what can we then do to counteract it? And again, we don't want to cast fear amongst people in community, but it's just taking that 1 or 2 seconds to just read that article, or if someone's listening to your podcast for the first time, I'd advise to go back to David's episodes, listen to them, because you'll start to understand, you'll see the similarities as to all these incidents unfold. And then you can say, well, what could I do slightly differently? So yeah, it's interesting.
And so thinking about what happened in Denver last week, so this is about 1,000 student school. It's about 40 minutes or so outside of Denver. It's in one of the mountain towns, really affluent community. It was the #1 performing school in the state. And it's kind of an L-shaped campus that has, between the L is a large football field and athletic fields. And then south of the campus is a big community park and rec center and so on. And at kind of the point of the L is where the school's cafeteria is. So around noon, when all the students were in the cafeteria, a 16-year-old pulls a revolver out and opens fire in the cafeteria. And fortunately, a revolver only fires 6 rounds at a time. So in his first 6 shots, he critically wounds one student in the cafeteria. And then everybody starts running immediately. So thinking run, hide, fight. You're in a cafeteria, there's nowhere to really hide there in a big open space. Fighting is an option, but also for most students, because the cafeteria is a big space also, is get out. There are lots of doors and get out. So the students start running. The kid reloads and then runs out onto the football field where, lots of schools, when you practice evacuations or if you do a full-scale exercise for an active shooter, police are going to evacuate people to a big common area off in the football field. So there are a bunch of students who end up as they run out on the football field. So he chases them across the football field, continuing to fire. So they run further off campus and he chases them to the edges of the campus and continues to fire. I think the point of that story is that it's your flexibility in that guidance. So within your book, you break down chapters around what's run, hide, fight, and then what does it mean to run? What does it mean to hide? What
Yeah.
does it mean to fight? How would you kind of apply that to first thinking about that scenario in Denver, but then what are the pros and cons of kind of those different actions when you're in that place?
Yeah, and so obviously another tragic event took place there, and I think what I would start with is that level seven I mentioned earlier, David. The run, hide, fight is not an order; it's a menu depending on those adverse situations that you find yourself in. I mean, we won't sort of go down the threat assessment piece and missed warning signs, that type of stuff. We'll go down within the moment, and obviously, if you have the option to run away from danger, that is the preferred option. So we're going to try and do those templates that I've mentioned. That when we're sat in that cafeteria, we're forward thinking where you might sit. I'm going to sit close to an exit. I'm going to sit close to a window, and then you really have to just apply critical thinking. And most often, is there a right? Excuse me. Is there a right or wrong answer? Um, in the situation, hindsight might say there is, but in that moment, you just have to make the best situation. So hopefully, you've applied the template where you're sitting, and you just have to come down to what is my best option, and you've only got seconds to make that decision. So what I would just encourage people to do wherever they walk in is just think, if something happened now, is my best option to run? Is it to hide? Is it to fight? And think about where they position themselves. Um, what comes with run, hide, fight is the flexibility. But even if you can run, you're going to run away till you're not going to look back until you know you're clear. But even if you're going to hide, you're going to prepare your defense plan. So if I'm in the cafeteria and there's a room where I can hide, I'm going to lock the door, barricade the door, and at the same time I'm thinking if that door opens, what am I then going to do? So I think the only advice I can really give David is very challenging, but you've got to keep those options fluid and never consider them to be in order and never consider them to be final. You might need to adapt at each occasion. You could run away, and then in the Roxborough High School, there's another shooter somewhere else that you weren't even aware of. So run, hide, fight is fluid and it's flexible, and ultimately based on things that you know, you're just going to make a decision. You've got to make a decision, and that decision has to be a positive decision. And whatever you do it with sort of oomph and gusto. That we're going to barricade, or I'm going to run as far as I can, or I'm going to fight as hard as I can. So it's a challenging question you posed, David. I can't really say too much other than those are options. They're not a menu. Sorry,
Yeah.
they are options, but it's not an order.
And I think one caveat to add on the hiding, because I think this gets left out of a lot of the training and discussions around it, is to also not trap yourself in a
Yeah,
place that you can't get out of, because something that is part of almost every school shooting plot is either some type of bomb, Molotov cocktail, flammable liquid, propane tank, chemical gas release. That's almost always part of the plot. It's rarely actually used during a shooting. And if you end up in a space like a closet or an upper floor classroom that has, say, ballistic or glazed windows that you can't break, if you barricade that door and then there's either fire or a chemical release, you've now trapped yourself in a place that you can't get out of. So we always need to
yeah,
think about, you want to have space between yourself and the shooter. If you can do that by running, that's your best choice. If there's nowhere to run, then if you can put things and spaces and doors and desks and things between yourself and the shooter, you're in a much better situation. But you've got to remember, you don't want to be trapped in a space either. You also make some important points in the book about the differences between walls and when you're
yes, yeah.
safe behind a wall and when you're not. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, and as you were talking, and my brain was thinking, we need to do like cover versus concealment. So, concealment, right, is what you most often see in the police dramas. There's a police chase, the door opens, the cop's behind the door shooting towards the bad guy, and the bad guy is shooting towards the police officer. That makes great TV, but does it keep that police officer safe? Because that's concealment, right? So that door doesn't stop bullets. So cover would be going behind maybe a brick wall, which is 6 feet, 6 feet in like an old school, or
The
some
church
maybe
in
lots of
many
like
the
yeah,
church at Annunciation School. I mean,
yeah,
a
yeah. So
hundred
so it's
bullets were
getting
fired. Most of them didn't go through those heavy block
the
walls of the
walls,
church.
yeah, yeah. So when you're thinking about this, concealment is the simplest way is concealment is the 1990s or 1980s police drama when the bad guy is shooting behind his car, the bad guy shooting at him, and nothing happens. Well, that isn't protecting that police officer. So when you think of concealment, thinking that 80s police officer behind the door, the cover, as David mentioned, is getting behind thick concrete walls, getting behind multiple layers, things that are going to keep you safe. And as you're hiding, you're also thinking about this as well. It doesn't happen very often, David, does it? But the last few shootings, I think in the Presbyterian school in Tennessee, the Covenant, that person was shooting through some of the walls. I mean, they also let off like a lot of rounds. So that's the difference. Is concealment means that I can't be seen, but it's not going to protect me. Cover is like going behind thick walls. And as you mentioned, the tragedy at the Annunciation School, we heard a lot of people, what do? They duck down and hid behind pews. That doesn't help. I think at Virginia Tech, David, it could have been the same in the cafeteria where people were hiding down under tables and chairs. That's concealment. That's not cover. So you've got to get behind a locked door. Preferably thick walls, which is actually going to protect you against a bullet or a round coming in. And if you can't do that, that's when it's about multiples and it's fluid. You're then going to say, well, this is my hiding spot for now, but maybe this isn't my final hiding spot. I might need to try and find something else. What does that look like? Take that deep breath and figure out, do I stay here or do I move somewhere else? So concealment is the police officer behind his car door isn't very good. And then cover is the thick walls. Yeah, it's really important. I'm glad that you remind me of that. Super important.
Yeah, and that's something that people can do and look around too. If you're a teacher in a classroom, if you're a parent at back to school night, if it's your own office, is realizing what is drywall and what is a block wall. And there are two differences. There's
Yeah,
hollow block, which are called cinder blocks, and you see them at the hardware store, and that is the shape of concrete, but it's hollow in the middle. And if you fire a 223 round, which is your standard
yeah,
semi-auto rifle, it goes through with almost no velocity loss. So like the walls between classrooms, if they're hollow block, then a bullet is going to go right through that. So you don't have any sort of protection. Um, so you would need to ask and even look at the structural design to know whether something is a heavy masonry solid concrete wall versus a hollow block versus drywall. But that can work to your advantage as well.
yeah,
This is a story I haven't told before on the podcast, but I worked at a government office where one of the employees of that office made direct threats of violence against some of the other people in the office, to the point of he talked about bringing a bomb to the workplace. He talked about the guns that he had. He had a knife that he carried around, and during meetings, he'd flip his knife open and point it at different people at the table, but then laugh and say, "This is a tool, not a weapon."
yeah,
And HR, didn't intervene because they felt that might tip him over the edge, which unfortunately is kind of a situation that plays out quite a bit. But the point of this story is that I was in a large government building that had been renovated many times, and we had little offices that had paper thin drywall between them. So he was on my same hallway, and my plan was always, if I heard a gunshot, I was going to run as hard as I could into the drywall, which I would go through and I'd end up in the next office suite, and then I would just keep running. So thinking about not being trapped somewhere, knowing what can give you protection or not, and thinking about that ahead of time. If you're in a classroom and you're locked down, or if you're in an office and you're locked down and the shooter is coming closer and closer and you hear gunshots getting closer, you can get out, and you can get out by lots of means. And you can go up through a drop ceiling, you can jump out of a window. Kids did that at CVPA High in St. Louis. They jumped out of a third story window because that was better option than being in the same room as somebody with an AR-15 and 600 rounds of ammo. So you don't
Yeah.
have to, you've got to be on this continuum of knowing where you are, where you shouldn't be, and what protection you either have or don't have.
Yeah, and I think we cover this in the book about knowing your surroundings. So a couple of good things that Dave mentioned there. One I would say is never be embarrassed, I'm afraid, to walk in somewhere new and say to the person, where's the closest exit to this building? Or what are your walls made of? Who in 1025, who cares? Who cares what someone thinks about me? I'll ask the question when you go to the movie theatre, what are these walls made of? What is there doors to get out? So you've got to ask these questions. Don't feel that someone's judging you, they're laughing at you. My pastor tells a funny story that he was camping one time and he was asleep. He woke up and he thought he heard a bear, and he was shouting, "Bear, bear, bear, bear!" And there wasn't a bear. And he said everyone was like laughing at him afterwards, and trying to make him feel embarrassed. He's like, "Well, if there was a bear, I would have seen it and then run away, or you guys were sleeping." So he told the story as, "Don't be judged by others laughing at you." So I'd encourage you when you go to a restaurant, when you go to a bar, when you go to a sporting arena, when you go to a movie theatre, when you go to a grocery store, ask these questions or become familiar with the environment. And if it's your place to work, find out who's in charge of facilities and saying, "Can you give me a tour of this building? So if ever I need to get out of it quickly, I'll know where to go." And I bet, David, a lot of your listeners have never done that before. Go to facilities, go to operations, go to the custodian, say, "Can you give me a tour of the building?" Because that familiarity is going to help you in a time of need. It's going to speed up your reaction times. You asked me earlier about the difference between run, hide, fight in the Denver shooting. It's going to speed up your reaction time the more you know. I often say with a lot of these mass shootings, if you had 90 seconds head start, how different would your choices be? And then by asking questions and being inquisitive is going to give you that time, because you and I, David, know that a lot of these mass assailants, they're a math equation. It's distance over time that they've got. They want to kill people in the shortest distance, in the shortest amount of time, with the highest body count before two things happen: the death by cop, or they take their own life. The third one, hand himself in, happens, but most often it's the first two. We saw that in Annunciation school shootings. So if you know that, how can you? It's like that sort of 1980s game shows. Like how can you put seconds on the clock? And part of that comes with being inquisitive, asking those questions, and not fearing the judgment. Who cares what someone thinks about you? Ask the questions when you go somewhere new. Where's the emergency exits? Where's the door? Where would you recommend I go to stay safe? And then move on.
And that was one of the lessons I learned, from my 20 years in the fire department, was that every opportunity that you have inside a house or a building is an opportunity to look at how it's constructed, where the power comes in, where the breaker box is, where the gas service comes in, where the gas shutoff is, where the water shutoff is, um, what the windows look like. So every time we ran an EMS call, that's also an opportunity where you do a circle around the house and you say like, oh, in this neighborhood, in this block, in this style, the gas service is always on the right side of the porch. And you only see that when you're at that house for a sick person in the middle of the night. The same with commercial office buildings and things. Instead of taking the elevator back down to the bottom, take the stairwell back down to the bottom and see, are the fire extinguishers still in the panels. A really important thing for people in offices to think about is, if you do take the exit stairs, does the door lock behind you? Are you able to get back in? With the Covenant School in Nashville, that substitute teacher started to go down the stairs at the same time that the shooter was coming up the
Yeah.
stairs and was killed there in the stairwell. If you're in a commercial office building and you go into your stairs, is the only option, once you're in the stairwell, the exit door at the very bottom. And then even when you get into some buildings, maybe the stairs go all the way down to the parking garage, but you need to get out at the lobby to actually get out of the building. And those are things that you only get to know if you actually walk the stairs and you actually walk the back hallways of these buildings. And the last thing on that is, every time I stay in a hotel, when I leave the room for the first time, I take the stairs down to the lobby. So I want to see where that closest stairwell is, and I want to see where that door comes out, because maybe if there's a shooting in a common area and you go to evacuate and your stairwell puts you right into that common area, you've actually put yourself into a more dangerous situation.
Yeah. And you've done, by doing that at your hotel, you're putting seconds on the clock because you now know what your route is, as opposed to coming outside your hotel room when you're like, well, do I go, where's the stairs? How do I get down? So, that those seconds give you the time, the empowerment to make better decisions. What we don't want to do is be in a position where our decisions are rushed and we're not too sure what we're going to do. But yeah, what you've described, it puts seconds on the clock.
And then I think the last and most important point in your book is about the survival beyond the moment. So these
Yeah.
little tips and tricks that you can do in a moment of high stress and high intensity. What are some of those tips?
Yeah, and I think the first thing, and we saw this during Sandy Hook, because all the teacher had to do was go and press the sort of the little button on the door to lock the door, which seems simple to do, but when there's gunfire, when there's children screaming, and people are being sort of shot and killed, that's very difficult to do. So I think one of the simplest things to really do in that moment is you've got to take that, and this sounds crazy, David, but you've got to take that deep breath first, take that big inhale, try and level set your mind and say, okay, now, so what I can hear, and this goes back to what Meredith said about the school teachers when her son Nick was killed. There's a lot of people running around, no one knew quite what to do. So just taking that big deep breath, level set, gain your composure, because when emotion clouds judgment. So we want to take a deep breath, we want to level set, and then once we've found ourselves to say, what is the best thing for me to do? Because our brain is going to rush us in different directions, as opposed to just taking that 4 or 5 seconds to take that deep breath, level set, and say, okay, now, what are my best options? Because the emotion is going to cloud our judgment, and it's going to affect our ability to make sound decisions. So I think that is the simplest thing that we can do, is allow ourselves that moment just to level set where we are.
And I mean, part of that is I think people need to really understand what acute stress does to the body, and that it creates tunnel vision. It makes it very hard to do fine motor tasks. Your
Yeah,
hands can be shaking, or you can feel frozen. And a lot of the kind of tech-based security is around some really complicated processes. So, this was in Uvalde. The alert that went out to teachers was a text message on their phone that said, "Log into this app for your emergency alert." Well, in normal situations, it can be pretty difficult to log into an app because, do you know the password? Does the Face ID work? Does it time out while you're logging in? Has your password expired? Did you have the right username? That's an app you don't use every day. It can be pretty tough to navigate, much less when you're in a very intense emergency and you might need to punch something into that app. So I think we've got to think about, you need simplicity, you need training for people to know how to do tricks like taking a deep breath or taking a moment or putting their mind in a calm space. Because the thought that when you hear gunshots, a teacher is going to be able to grab a little key card and they're going to know that 4 clicks mean this and 6 clicks mean that and 8 clicks mean this. That is just not realistic under these acute stress circumstances.
yeah, and it's the repetition of multiple steps. So when you do your Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and often people smile at this, David, but I always say, do I know the day when I fell in love with my wife? And the answer is no, because it was over a series of consistent days and times that all of a sudden I woke up and said, actually, I love this woman. But I can't tell you the day that I fell in love, because it's about consistency of multiple steps. And that's what we're really asking is great you mentioned that. The fine motor skills, gross motor skills, that's what we're going to lose. In Sandy Hook, all the teacher had to do was walk to the door and press the button. All they had to do was press the button to lock the door. but that's very difficult when you lose your fine and gross motor skills. So the consistency of doing the same action time and time again, that's how we train our children, right? But the consistency, that is what builds that buffer. That's what allows you, to take that deep breath and say, I've been here before. I can persevere. I know there's hope. I'm now going to go into these steps. If you don't have that consistency, what I find, David, and I know a lot of you superintendents and school leaders listen to your podcast, is I find they'll just do all the drills in the first semester, but let's just get them out of the way. Well, that doesn't build muscle memory. Don't just say we're going to do all our drills in the first semester so we can tick the box to say we've done them. You're trying to build that muscle memory. So you're at that point when you say, I don't know when I fell in love with this person, but I know I'm in love with it. It was those consistent steps. That's what helps you with your fine and gross motor skills. When you're doing your Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, when someone's pinning you to the ground, you've been there before and you know the technique to get round. So then you do that technique. And I think what we find is a lot of people don't have that depth. So they don't have that 1980s Rolodex to be able to pull that information because they've not been there before. So I'd really encourage people, it's that consistency which is going to help improve your fine and gross motor skills because you'll be able to recover quicker. Does that sort of make sense, David?
Yeah, and people, I think, also don't realize how much repetition you need to learn things to the point where you're going to remember them during a moment of high intensity. So in the fire academy, every single morning for months, one of the first things you do is pick up a ladder, and it was called the hill from the training academy's engine room where we would set up in the morning up to the burn building, which was a simulation of a bunch of different types of buildings all combined together. And the first thing that you would do is pick a ladder up and walk up the hill and walk a circle around the burn building. And the entire time you said, I'm looking for wires, obstructions, and other firefighters. I'm looking for wires, obstructions, and other firefighters. Because every single year, there are firefighters killed or severely injured because they get to a house fire in the middle of the night and there's fire coming from the windows or there's somebody trapped. And the first thing they want to do is throw a ladder to that window, and they throw a metal ladder right into the wires from the street to the house, and they're electrocuted. Or somebody on the ladder truck grabs the ladder, swings it around, and hits the guy in the engine company who's kneeling down to set up the hose right in the head with the ladder. And that's firefighters who work in high intensity situations all the time end up injuring and killing themselves because you literally need repetition. If something is coming down to a life safety decision, you need repetition of it every single day. And if it's something you do one time in a seminar or one time a year in a training, you are not going to remember or think or act that way under a high intensity circumstance.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the last 3 to 5 years, David, where I think we'd all agree this peak is rising, right? I think we'd all agree that. I think I would encourage your superintendents, educators, people that work in school safety to listen to this podcast. I would really challenge them and say, are you doing enough? So Minnesota in 2023 created laws around how many drills that a school needs to take place from. I think it was I can't remember, but I think it's middle school, high school. It could have been elementary school as well. I forget, but nonetheless, I think the question that people should ask themselves is are we doing enough to build that muscle memory? If the law says you need to do 4 drills a year, is 4 drills enough? If it says you need to do like 4, 5 drills a year, is 4 enough? And I think we've got to challenge the status quo and say, well, we're not just doing enough. Going back to the Colorado shooting you mentioned, we're in the food court area. Do we have a solid emergency operations plan is the basis, because that's what people we're going to train on. And then the second is, are we doing enough training? We heard this during the United Nations school shooting. The tragedy there was this little kid, Weston, I think he was a 7th grader, where he said, we'd practiced the drill in the school before, but we'd never done it in the church. I mean, that is disastrous for that community on the legality side, where you've got a 7th grader saying, oh yeah, we're practicing in the school, but we'd never done it in the church before. Well, you go to church every morning for morning mass. So I really encourage people to say, what is the number that you feel it will take to build that muscle memory that David described? And I bet you it's more than 4, 5, 6 times a year. What is it, David? Virginia Tech 97, whatever it was, 98. Anyone who's like 27 or under has lived in a world where we do drills. Adding 2 to 3 more isn't going to be a shock for most families because they're used to it. So I would encourage your listeners to say, are you doing enough drills to build that muscle memory? And if the answer is no, I think you've got to take the action to try and change that, right?
Yeah, and even if it's not formal drills, I think that your point that you've made throughout the discussion today and then on the book is that there are lots of informal things you can do that just take a couple seconds, and then they put you into a mindset of thinking about what would happen. So I think without ever having a drill or having an extra drill, a teacher could say at the start of each class, if there's an emergency, remember these windows go out. And
Yeah.
then the kids are not just thinking about that in that class, but they're thinking about that in all of their subsequent classes. And most shootings at schools don't happen when kids are in the classroom. They happen at arrival, dismissal, lunch, or when classes are changing. And I don't think there are any schools that have done active shooter drills for the time period between classes or have done drills during lunchtime. So they all make that same mistake that Annunciation had of not having a drill for morning mass. But that can be mitigated by having teachers and parents and encouraging kids even to have conversations with each other about, if something happens in this place, where am I going to go? If something happens here, where am I going to go? And if school officials need to be thinking about that and talking about that with kids too, because in Denver last week, there was almost an unnecessary part of that tragedy where it's predictable students are going to evacuate. That's been happening at every shooting for decades. Lots of kids are just going to run from the campus. Well, one of the kids who was critically injured ended up at the community center, which is off the campus. And it was 19 minutes after the shooting happened before EMS figured out where he was and got treatment to him. So you have somebody with a gunshot wound where that can be fatal within minutes at a predictable place, the community center near the campus, but probably not a place that school officials had ever talked about or planned or held an exercise related to the school. So we have to think bigger. We have to think about more circumstances. And I think you can have lots of informal conversations that get people prepped and prepared for all those possibilities.
Yeah, and what I tried to do in the book, in one of the sections, is just take different locations. I think we spoke about there's different case studies in there that people can follow, but we tried to give advice if you're at the grocery store, if you're out at the movie theatre, if you're at a sporting event. Sort of tried to break some of those down and give what some of those steps are, because quite often people say, well, Simon, what should we do? So if you do get a book, one of the chapters tries to break down as many sort of public spaces as possible. But the situation is fluid, and when seconds count, the police are minutes away. In this year, we have to own our own public safety. So you are the first responder. I spoke to a couple of people that know Annunciation School, and I know a couple of Catholic churches here in Minnesota. People said it took the Minneapolis Police Department 3 or 4 minutes to get there. That's still an eternity for an active assailant that we saw. But in those first 3 to 4 minutes, they had to be their own first responder. So I think they need to do everything possible about building the plan, drilling, asking those right questions. Yeah.
Well, Simon, in the show notes, I'm going to have a link to the book if anybody's interested in reading it. I think it's worthwhile. I'll also have a link there to your LinkedIn profile. You put a lot of great information out there as well. And then for anybody who's involved in security or attends or is just interested in security and shootings at houses of worship, I know that you have your own podcast, so I'll put a link to that as well. So Simon, thank you so much for coming across the pond to try to help us in America be a little bit safer. And I think that this is some really important information for everybody. So thank you.
Thank you, David. It's been an honor and a privilege, and as I said, a long time listener of the show. So great to have this conversation today. Thank you.
Well, sadly, when these attacks continue, this may not be our last conversation. So take care, and we'll speak again.